Hello and welcome again, students. Thank you for joining us today. This is our second session of our Launching Your Career webinar series. This session will be covering interviewing. Last week, we did a presentation on resumes. So hopefully, if you had the chance to attend that one, you found it helpful. And then now we'll be covering interviewing. And then next week, we'll be having our last session, which I'll talk about at the end. This series was created to support our graduating seniors as they transition to their careers, but also for all of our students who are interested in working on their professional development. We know that graduating and job searching can be scary and sometimes can cause some anxiety because you don't know what's next. So we hope that through this series and our support services, we're able to help you along your journey. So thank you for joining us. So for today's session, we'll be covering interview preparation. It's really important to prepare for interviews before you even have it. So we'll be covering and focusing a lot on that. We'll also cover commonly asked questions and how do you answer specific questions. I'll also cover some general interviewing tips. And then we'll go ahead and have our mock interviews. As you can see, we have some of our alumni and partners that work with us here to practice with you. So if you're interested in having a mock interview, please stick along for the second part of the presentation. We can go ahead and have those. And then we'll conclude with a Q&A and a raffles. And before we go into preparing for an interview, I'd like to talk about the purpose of an interview, because as I mentioned last week, for those of you that weren't here, the resume, cover letter, and the CV each have their own purpose. So it's good to compare the goal of each one. So for a resume and a cover letter, the purpose is actually to get you to an interview. So once you get to the interview, you might ask yourself, what is the purpose then of the interview? And that is, of course, to get you the job, but also for you to determine whether you're a good match for them and they're a good match for you. So employers usually want to know whether your experiences have prepared you for the job that they're looking to fill, whether you truly want the job because they want people who are passionate about the work that they're doing, and they want to make sure that their employees stick along. Also, will you fit in with the organization? And as I mentioned, this is important not only for the employer, but for you as well, because it's important that you're happy and that you're in an organization where you see yourself growing and you believe in the mission of the organization. So it's a win-win for both. And it should be a discussion. It should be sort of like a meeting where you get to know more about them, but they also get to know more about you. And now in regards to preparing for the interview, a couple first steps before you actually start preparing the questions and is to determine what type of interview you will have, because the type of interview will impact how you prepare. For example, if it'll be a phone interview, that one is usually just a screening of whether they're gonna go ahead and give you the second interview, which will usually be in person. So phone interviews are usually shorter than an actual in-person interview. They usually just wanna hear your communication. How you communicate over the phone has a lot to do with your communication skills. So those, like I mentioned, tend to be shorter than an actual interview. Panel interviews are also different because you will be hearing from different members of the organization. So you want to do your research as to who will be interviewing you. There's another type of interview that's a group interview where you will actually be interviewing with other candidates who are also applying for the job. So it's important to know the type of interview so that you can prepare accordingly. You also want to know how long the interview will take. And again, that depends on the type, but the length of it will also determine how you prepare for the interview, because if it's an hour-long interview, you should expect to receive a lot of questions. You should expect to have a lot of behavioral questions, which usually tend to take longer to respond to. Now, in terms of preparing for the questions themselves, you want to find sample questions. And I know we sent out commonly asked questions, but feel free to Google search depending on the role, because depending on the position and the field that you're applying and looking to work for, the questions can become very specific and tailored to that field or job. So for example, if you're applying for a graphic designer role, you can look up questions, interview questions for graphic designer, and you'll get to see some examples. But then you also want to prepare responses, and have a couple different responses, because depending obviously on the question, you can decide, oh, I'd rather go ahead and answer that question with this from this example from my work experience. So you want to prepare multiple responses. And then you also want to research the organization and develop questions for them, because as you all know, usually every interview ends with, do you have any questions for us? And it's really important to have those questions prepared for them as well, because that will show that you're interested in the job, that you did some research. And in terms of researching the organization, I recommend looking at the company website. You also want to look at news articles that perhaps have highlighted the organization that you're looking to work for, and social media. A lot of organizations already have social media, so looking through their social media will give you a little bit more insight in terms of the culture, the work that they're doing, and what's important for them, and can help you develop some questions. And then you also want to read the position qualification and job description, because that will allow you to prepare and determine what you want to focus on when you answer those questions from your work experience. So they're looking for someone that has a lot of teamwork experience. You might want to think about examples from the past where you practice your collaboration and teamworking skills. And the job description will also help you determine how you want to answer those questions. And then finally, you want to practice as much as you can and ask somebody for feedback. So it's good to practice by yourself in front of a mirror to practice how you're going to communicate, but it's also really important to practice with somebody, because they'll be able to provide you with feedback and you'll be able to improve on your interviewing skills even further. Now I'll be giving some tips for video interview, because especially now, a lot of interviews are being conducted online. So there's some specific tips that I can provide for video interviews, which would be to look directly at the camera. And I know that can be difficult, so I myself sometimes forget to look at the camera. So some tips for that would be to put a little sticky note next to the camera, put a picture. I've heard some people put like a small picture of someone they feel comfortable talking to, and that helps them. But it's important to look directly at the camera, because if you were in person, eye contact is really important. So just because it's video doesn't mean you can show eye contact. Technically, it's difficult, especially if there's multiple people, but try to keep your eyes on the camera. You also want to dress as if you were having an in-person interview. This demonstrates that you're taking the interview very seriously, and it'll also help you boost your own confidence and really fit in the role of an interview and do well. You also want to choose a neutral background. So this is really important, because you don't want any distractions in your background. If the employer is looking at your background instead of focusing on you, then that would be a bad sign. So you want to have the least distractions as possible. If you're using a virtual background, make sure it's professional and that it also doesn't have a lot of things going on, because that can also be distracting for the employer. You also want to find an appropriate location and internet signal, because the last thing you want is to be struggling with Wi-Fi issues or having a lot of noise in the background. So make sure you have a quiet space and that your internet signal is good. Of course, you want to hope that the employer would understand if there was some technical difficulties, but you don't want to risk it, and you want to make sure that you're prepared for that. And you also want to make sure you have a professional picture and name on your Zoom profile in case you have to turn off your camera for some reason, or while you're waiting for them to log on. You want to have a professional picture and your name. Make sure that you have your full complete name. And finally, pay attention to body language. So this is really important in an in-person interview, because a lot of times they look at whether you're fidgeting with your legs or your hands. And although it's video and they can't really see what you're doing with your legs, it's still important to try to sit up straight, to show enthusiasm, to use your hands as you're talking, if that helps you show more enthusiasm. So that's what I mean by paying attention to your body language. Now we'll go ahead and talk about the difference between interview questions. So we usually have traditional questions and behavioral questions. And the traditional questions are the ones that are straightforward. They really want to just know about your experience, your background, personal qualities, while behavioral questions tend to be more situational. They ask you about a time where you should demonstrate leadership or initiative. And the purpose of those is to predict your future behavior in that work environment. So an example of a traditional question would be, tell me about yourself. We all know, we often hear that question. It's probably in every single interview, and it can be a difficult one to answer, but I'll go more into detail in regards to how do you answer that question. And then what are your greatest strengths and weaknesses? That's another example of a traditional question. Now for behavioral questions, an example would be, tell me about a time when you influenced the outcome of a project by taking a leadership role. So as you can see, they want you to reflect on a past behavior, and they use it in order to predict future. Now, in regards to how do you answer these questions? So the tell me about yourself question, you really want to start off by talking about your current position. I know in the past, I was mentioning to Fatima and Christina that I used to think this question was really to learn more about me. So I would talk about where I was born, where my parents were from, and I would talk about my hobbies. But later I found out like there's actually a way you should answer this question, and the employer really wants to know about your experience and whether you're a good fit. So there's actually a structure you can follow where you start with your current position, you mention key points and relevant experience, probably like your most recent experience, and you focus on what you did in that specific role and results. And then you want to end it with connecting it to your background, your experience, your passions, and back to the job. So for example, you could end it with, I'm interested in this role because my future plans are to apply to a master in public health. And so this role will allow me to prepare for that. So you want to connect it back to why you want the job and how it ties to your own interests or passions. In regards to what are your greatest strengths and weaknesses question, you want to point out strengths that are relevant to the job that you're applying for, and you want to give examples. It's really important to back up these strengths with examples from your past work experience. And then for the weakness question, it's really important to be honest and to mention a weakness, because the employers know that we all have weaknesses. So they're not looking for someone to answer this question by saying that they don't have any or that they're perfect. They actually want you to mention a weakness. And most importantly, they want you to focus on what you're doing to improve on that weakness. So we'll go ahead and actually do an example of that. Fatima will pretend she's the employer, and I'm going to go ahead and answer that question.
Thank you, Eloise. And for your next question, could you please elaborate on a weakness that you consider that you have it that you would like to work on in the next upcoming months?
Yes. So one of my weaknesses is public speaking. As an introvert, I consider myself to be somewhat shy, so it's hard for me to talk in front of large groups. But I've definitely had the chance to practice this in my previous role. I had the opportunity to lead a couple presentations, and I've actually recently enrolled in a public speaking course in my local community college. So through that, my previous experience and the course, I hope to continue improving on this, and so that it no longer is one of my weaknesses. So as you—
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Fatima. As you noticed, in my response, I answered by mentioning what my weakness is. I also tied it to my personality so that I kind of gave some background, and then what I'm doing to improve on it. So I gave 2 examples of what I'm doing to improve on it, but usually you can only it's okay if you only give 1. So that was an example of that question, which I agree, it's a very difficult question to answer, but once you get the hang of it and you prepare for it, it'll be okay. And so now for behavioral questions. These, as I mentioned, tend to focus on your skills. So they'll usually ask about a time where you demonstrated teamwork, leadership, initiative, creativity. And the way you want to answer these is by focusing on your past experience, as I mentioned, but really on specific actions that you took and the results. So last week, I talked about the STAR approach and how you can use that to write your resume. So in a similar way, you can actually use the STAR approach to prepare your answers for these types of questions. For example, you want to think about a situation or task where you demonstrated teamwork. What was the problem? Why did you need to use teamwork? Then you want to talk about an action. What did you do? What was your role? What skills did you use? And then you want to end it with the results. So if your actions led to an increase in blank, or it led to an award, whatever the result was, you want to highlight that as to conclude your answer. And so now we're going to again show an example. This time I'll be asking Fatima. So Fatima, are you ready? Okay. So Fatima, can you please tell me about a time where you took initiative?
Yes, Eloisa, thank you. Yes, actually, a couple years ago, when I first started my role at One Future Coachella Valley, one of my tasks was to assist with the logistics of the one-on-one student meetings. So as part of the task, I had to coordinate the scheduling of appointments and capture meeting notes. And although OFCV already had a process in place on how these tasks were conducted, I quickly realized that the process was taking way too long. It was consuming too much time, and it was requiring too many steps to complete. So I took it upon myself to research ways in which we could automate some of the process in order to increase our department's efficiency. So I started looking into the tools and software that we were already using and was able to create a more user-friendly scheduling experience for students, as well as a seamless way to capture live one-on-one meetings and action items. So as a result, we were actually able to complete over 600 individual one-on-one meetings with our scholars throughout the academic year. And it also allows us to allocate some of our time on other projects.
Awesome, thank you, Fatima. So as you all notice, and let me see if I can go back to the other slide. In her response, she really talked about the situation. So she talked about needing that platform to schedule those appointments and what the problem was, that it was taking too long. Then she talked about what she did. So in her case, she did research in regards to other software that she could use to make this faster, and her skills. So they would be researching, it would be the taking initiative. And then the result was that it led to, and she mentioned the number, which is really important. If you're able to quantify your results, it's really important to do that. So she mentioned it led to 600 appointments. So that was a really good example of how you would answer that question. Thank you once again, Fatima. And so now, once you answer your questions, then you will be asked, do you have any questions for us? And as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to have those questions ready for the employer or whoever is interviewing you. You want to prepare at least 3 to 4 questions. And I included some examples of what those questions can look like. I know oftentimes students have asked us, what types of questions can we ask? So here are some examples. One could be, how would you describe the culture of this organization? And by culture, I mean like the work style. And again, this is important because as I mentioned earlier, it's important for you to learn about them as well as it's important for them to learn about you. And this will help you learn about the organization and whether it will fit and match your own work style. What kind of training do you offer new employees? This is important if professional development is important for you. So you want to learn whether they're invested in their employees, if they're constantly working on giving trainings on their growth. So it's important to ask about that if that's important for you. And then the third question, and I'll read this one out loud. It says, I noticed your organization follows a collective impact approach. How has the pandemic impacted your collaboration with community partners? So this question is good because it shows that you did your research, that you know about the organization, you know about collective impact approach. So they will most likely be surprised that you know about their style, you did your research and you prepared. And then the second part of the question, it shows that you're analytical, that you're already thinking about how things change, and maybe you're asking this because you're concerned and you want to address this. If the pandemic impacted it in a negative way, you're probably thinking how you can address that. So it's a really good question, and there's different examples of how you can create questions like this based on the organization. So that's why it's important to look at their website, like I mentioned, news articles, and also think about the current workforce, what's going on in the community where the organization is located. Those are important things to consider. And so once you've concluded your interview, it's important to still take a few extra steps. So this is regarding post-interview etiquette. You want to send a thank you email, usually within 24 hours of your interview. And in this thank you email, you want to thank them, of course, for the opportunity. You want to mention something that happened during the interview if they talked about something that impressed you. For example, this example that I have here says, I was impressed with the effective manner in which consolidated engineering has adapted the management by objective system. So they're referencing something in the interview, and this helps when if the organization is interviewing a lot of candidates, it helps them remember who you were and what you talked about. And then you want to conclude this thank you email by mentioning your interest again and letting them know that you're looking forward to hearing from them. So that, and I have an example here. And then you also, at the end of an interview, you want to ask them when you should expect to hear from them, because if you don't hear back within the given time frame, you want to send a follow-up email. So if they told you you should expect to hear back within 2 weeks, and after those 2 weeks come up, if you haven't heard back, you can send a follow-up email where you can ask about the status of the job search, of the hiring process, I mean, and also ask if there is any information or additional documents you can provide to facilitate their hiring decision. So that would be an example of something you can mention in the follow-up email. So some general interviewing tips. Again, prepare as much as possible, and that's by creating, looking for those interview questions, figuring out what type of interview you will have, and practicing. Schedule a mock interview, that would be the practicing part. You also want to practice self-care before the interview. So whether that means taking a walk, doing breathing exercises, going to the bathroom, having water, all those things really matter and can make a difference in how you perform. So make sure you practice self-care, especially because I know interviews can be nerve-wracking. So you want to make sure you're calm and ready. And then, as I just mentioned, you want to send the thank you emails and follow-up. And in the case that you don't get the job, you still want to send that thank you email. I know in the past for me, there was an internship that I applied for and I didn't get the internship, but I still sent the thank you email and I maintained that relationship. And then 2 months later, I guess they opened up another interview position and they contacted me. So I think sending that thank you email is really important because you're not burning the bridge, you're maintaining the relationship, and it shows that you're professional and that you're still interested in other opportunities. So it's really important. And then it's also important because you can ask for feedback in this follow-up email. Even if you were rejected, you can ask for feedback and that will help you prepare for future interviews. And sometimes in this feedback, you might end up finding out that there was nothing you could have done to improve. It's just that they decided to go with somebody else because perhaps they had more experience. And that will also be good feedback for you because now you know that your interviewing skills are actually very good. And now you can continue interviewing and applying for other roles. And as always, stay calm. As I mentioned, interviews can be scary. So you want to stay calm and you want to just let them make the decision. There's nothing you can do after you interview. So just let time and be patient. And so that concludes the content part of this presentation. Are there any questions, Fatima? I haven't been able to see the chat.
I don't see any questions on the chat. Oh, actually, yes, we do. Luis is asking, how will you ask for the post-interview feedback in the best way? I think it might have covered in the thank you. You want to elaborate a little bit?
Okay, let me see if So one way I would do it is I would just simply ask, again, I would thank the employer for the opportunity to interview, and then I would let them know I am still looking for a role in this position and I will continue to apply and interview for jobs. I was wondering if you can provide any feedback in regards to my interview so that I can best prepare for future interviews. So I would just mention that you're still looking for a role in that position and because of that, that's why you're asking for the feedback. And most employers are more than willing to give you that feedback. I've actually done it myself. I know Christina mentioned to me the other day that she also asked for feedback. So employers are more than willing to offer this. And if the professionals that are here in the presentation, if they want to comment on that, if they've asked for feedback and if employers are willing to do that, and how you go about it, I can give an example of that. But I think for the most part, simply asking them for feedback, they're understanding and they know that you're still looking for opportunities. So they'll be more than happy to provide it. Any other questions?
I think that's all I see right now, Elo. in the chat at least.
Next week, we'll have our last session of this series. We will have an HR panel that will talk more about the job searching process. They'll talk about local opportunities and how do you stand out amongst other candidates. So please join us for that. We'll have someone from Eisenhower. We'll have someone from the India Workforce Center. And then we'll also have someone from our team, Jackie. So please join us for that. It'll be a great opportunity to ask them questions specific to job searching. And even if you have questions about resume or interviews, they will also be able to give you more guidance on that. If there's any final comments, questions, or from my team, anything I missed, before we wrap up, I want to be mindful of your time.
Can I just give a quick tip? One thing that really stands out to me when I do interviews is in the thank you note, if the person references something that we talked about or something that stood out, that really helps. Because if you're interviewing, 5 or 6 people, sometimes people can get jumbled in your mind after a long day. So if they say, I really enjoyed talking to you about this designer, and I went to look at them after our interview, that really stands out to me.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. That's really important.
Yeah, I think it also shows that they're actively listening or paying attention, right, in that conversation. So I just really want to say thank you to our professionals who took the time today to share it with our students. And I want to thank our students for also taking on this challenge. I know it can put us in a vulnerable, position or situation, but I think it's practice makes perfect. And this is a really safe space with people who want to support you. So I just want to thank everyone, Eloisa and Fatima, for a great presentation, and just overall, everyone, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much again for your willingness to support our students and our students for joining us today. And we hope to see you in our final session next week. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Great job, guys.